All right, here we are for our next video lecture in our Philosophy of Law and Justice lecture series. We're going to be talking about this book by David Schlosberg, Defining Environmental Justice, Theories, Movements, and Nature. And it's a big book. It's probably most appropriate for a graduate seminar. So we'll be talking about it in broad strokes and moving pretty quickly. And we'll be listening to a French band called Air, since this is about environmental justice. So, what I want you to do is to open the PDF and look at the table of contents. This book is very nicely organized into 4 parts, but we're only reading the first 3. Number 1, Justice, Theory, and Practice. Part 2, Movement, Definitions of Environmental Justice. And Part 3, Doing Justice to Nature. So, basically, this book was written by Schlosberg because, as the intro indicates, he wrote another book, and the objection he got to that book was, but what is environmental justice? And whoever asked that question didn't think he sufficiently answered it in his previous book. So, what I want you to do is to look at the questions on the discussion board and basically just read the text in an effort to answer these questions. So you don't have to get bogged down in all the details. He talks about a lot of other contemporary philosophers. I just want you guys to know the, like I said, the broad strokes, the major questions. Here are the major questions. What is environmental justice? How is it different than ecological justice? So environmental justice, ecological justice. What are those two? What's the differences between them? What is environmental racism? And how do we see that as a part of environmental injustice? As Schlosberg is reviewing classic theories of justice, he has one main approach that he uses as both a foil that he wants to argue against, but also something that he wants to incorporate. And that is the distributive theory of justice. And since we read John Rawls's Justice is Fairness, he is a very representative example of someone who advocates for contemporary liberalism through a notion of justice based in distribution. So just a quick review. Remember that in forming a theory of political justice, John Rawls invited us into the original position where we would start making decisions about how the basic goods of society would be distributed in terms of the institutions that we set up. And we do this from behind the veil of ignorance. So when we talk about the 2 principles of justice, the idea that number 1, everybody is a free and equal citizen and everybody has the same guaranteed basic level of rights. And the second principle of justice was that if there is any inequality, especially economic inequality, we only allow it to exist if it can benefit the least advantage. So in that second principle of justice, which we call the difference principle, what it's really about is making sure that whatever types of inequality exist, we're going to balance that inequality by properly distributing the basic goods of society more fairly. So it's really a question of justice seen as distribution. How are we going to divide up not divide up, but how are we going to ensure that everybody has the same kind of rights, everybody has the same access to the same kinds of things that they need to live a life as a free and equal citizen in a liberal democracy? So, the first few pages talk about the notion of justice as distribution, or what's called the distributive theory of justice. And it's also wrapped very much in utilitarian thinking. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory advocated by John Stuart Mill that said actions are right to the extent that they provide the greatest good for the greatest number. So if we take that from an ethical framework and import it into a political framework, then we should be distributing the goods that we have in society in a way that creates the most amount of good for the most amount of people. And again, when we say goods, we're talking about things like wealth and jobs and access to education and healthcare and food and dignified labor and institutions like the courts, the Congress, etc., etc. So, he says distribution is good. We need to ask these questions of how we distribute these goods. But distribution by itself, while necessary, is not sufficient. So we do need the distributive theory of justice, but if we really wanted to have a rounded theory of justice, social justice, political justice, and I'm not even yet talking about environmental ecological justice, but just political justice in general, then mere questions about distribution won't really suffice. And so he highlights, even in the first intro chapter, what other things need to be on the table. And always remember that the first chapter of an academic book like this is basically a map for the rest of the book. He lays out exactly what why he's writing the book, the thesis, what problems he is trying to answer or take up, and then the conceptual resources that he's going to use throughout the book, he lays them on the table in the intro. So if you're having trouble reading this book, read the intro and it gives you a map. Okay, so what else is missing and what else do we need to have besides the distributive theory of justice? Well, 3 other categories: recognition, capabilities, and participation. Recognition, capabilities, and participation. He says all 4 of these things, those 3 plus distribution, need to be on the table if we're going to have a robust theory of political justice. So, let's briefly look at what he means by each of these. So first of all, he uses representative thinkers of each of these categories. So let's take up recognition. So he uses Iris Young as the person who's representative of this theory. So recognition, so there's this phrase, the politics of recognition. Recognition, of course, means who is recognized, but recognized as what? Recognized as a free and equal citizen, and who is, let's say, exploited or disadvantaged and not seen as such. So the basic idea here is that, still just talking about political justice, not yet environmental justice, we need to recognize everybody as a free and equal citizen. Now, read against something like Rawls's philosophy, that seems obvious because he said that from the get-go. But people like Rousseau and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, those old school modern social contract theorists, were writing at a time in which non-whites, particularly blacks and other people of color, were not recognized as free and equal citizens. Black people were not even recognized as fully humans, but 3/5 human, and they were treated as property, which is repugnant. So that's an example of how some people might not have been recognized. Another lack of recognition would be the rights of women. So women might have been considered fully human in a 18th century mindset, but certainly they didn't get the right to vote till 1919. So they were not recognized fully as citizens. So we have 2 examples here, non-whites in women as 2 categories of people that were not recognized as free and equal citizens, and so were excluded from full participation in citizenship. And when some people are excluded, particularly more than half the population, that is a major, glaring, problematic omission. So when we talk about distribution, the question is, well, who gets goods distributed to them? If they are not recognized as free and equal citizens, then they would never be the recipients of of whatever kinds of goods are distributed throughout society. So that's why we also need recognition on the table. So recognition has a lot to do with your status as a human being, your status as a citizen. So to the second category, participation. Capabilities. So this begins on page 20. The real discussion begins on page 29. So he uses Amartya Sen and most famously Martha Nussbaum as the people who are representative of this approach. So I'm reading from page 29, last sentence that continues on the other page. The central argument of their capability approach is that we should judge just arrangements not only in simple distributive terms, but also more particularly in how those distributions affect our well-being and how we function. Capabilities are about a person's opportunities to do and to be what they choose in the context of a given society. The focus is on individual agency, functioning, and well-being rather than on more traditional distributive indicators. Okay, so a lot of these different approaches are kind of overlap and tied together. So when you think about recognition, why were some people not recognized as full citizens? Well, probably because they were not recognized as having the proper capabilities to be full citizens. So let's take women for example. So even a famous philosopher like Immanuel Kant said that women as the fair sex were less rational than men. So they were not considered as capable as men to think rationally, to participate in public life, to leave the domestic sphere and go into the public sphere. So the same was the case with non-whites and people of color. They were treated as intellectually inferior, subhuman, and lacking the capabilities. And this would include also indigenous people of the Americas, Native Americans, seen as not being fully capable of participating in this kind of political system. So if you're not capable, then you don't get recognized, and if you don't get recognized, you don't get the benefits of the distribution. On page 31, he quotes Nussbaum's capability set. So what do we need for these capabilities? Life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination and thought, emotions, and practical reason. So reason on the old school liberal distributive approach was thought to be the central, if not only, capability that you would need. But Nussbaum wants to also highlight, for example, not just reason of the mind, but the health of the body, and not just the physical health of the body, but the emotional significance as well. And so participation, the next approach, deals with just who gets to participate in the in full citizenship, in liberalism and democracy. And so participation is going to be essential. But not everyone has had a seat at the table, and so not everybody gets to participate. So we need all four of these approaches in a robust theory of political justice: the distributive approach, capabilities, recognition, and participation. Okay, so those are the resources he's put on the table. And here's where he's going. He's going to say, okay, so talked about an old school definition of political justice as a distributive justice. Even for political justice just among human beings, regarding more straightforward political considerations, distribution alone doesn't work, so we have to have recognition, participation, and capabilities on the table too. If we're going to now start talking about environmental justice, then if the distributive theory of justice didn't work for regular political justice, it's probably not going to work for environmental justice. So we need to take those four approaches, use them as resources, and apply them to issues in environmental justice. So that brings us to the question of what is environmental justice. So, looking again, I mean, this discussion, the robust discussion, begins in part 2 on page 45, but we get a basic definition just on page 3. Wait, do we? Well, I can't seem to find the quote I was looking for. Let me just speak off the top of my head. So, environmental justice concerns the justice among human beings regarding environmental resources such as air, water, land, food, and other kinds of environmental resources. So how are such environmental resources, for example, distributed? And who are they distributed to based on who is recognized, based on who has certain capabilities, and who gets participation in the process? So let's begin this discussion by a contemporary example that you might have heard about, which is the Flint water crisis. So, what happened in Flint, Michigan was that the source of the water going into the town was changed from, from one source to another source. And when it shifted to this other source, there are certain inhibitors that were supposed to be put in place that would help clean and filter the water or otherwise ensure its safety. And those inhibitors were not put in place. Consequently, some of the citizens in Flint were got water that had very problematic levels of lead in it. And really any level of lead in water is probably problematic. And so, I was just writing about this in an article, when I looked at the research last, which was just a month ago, 12 people have died, tens of thousands have gotten sick, but we probably won't even really know the full toll on the consequences for the people of Flint from this water crisis for years to come, because it has to be studied. So, the idea that a poor town that is predominantly made up of people of color like Flint, Michigan would get this tainted water and not necessarily other areas of Detroit or the wealthy suburbs of Detroit, I believe like Dearborn, Michigan. That's a question about distribution. So why was it that the people in Flint, Michigan were thought to be, why was it thought that they could get bad water, that they could get tainted water? Because they are people of color, predominantly black people, we can contextualize this in a long kind of history of environmental racism, where people of color, specifically because they are people of color, are targeted for lower quality goods and less distribution of all goods because they are people of color, and they are held to not matter as much compared to white people. I mean, that's the critique from someone who's looking at it through the lens of environmental racism. So, that is a very problematic occurrence to have happened. And again, there's this legacy of racism which is that people of color are somehow less worthy because they are less rational and have less faculties like reason, autonomy, etc., then they are not recognized as mattering equally to that of whites. They are not recognized as being full participants in a theory of justice. So if there is money to be made by redirecting the water from one source to another, but certain people are going to lose out, they're going to be the losers of this shift, then the people chosen to be the losers are going to be the people who are thought to be less worthy. And so we can see how the distribution is connected to issues of capability, recognition, and participation. So that is an example of environmental injustice, specifically environmental racism. So that example kind of shows why you would need all four approaches on the table, because if certain people are not recognized as being fully capable of being full citizens, then they won't get to be recognized as such, and they won't get to participate in political justice or in the political process, despite the fact that they actually are worthy and capable of being recognized and of full participation. It is the racist mentality, the essentialist racist notion that they are not, that accounts for the mistreatment. And that's something that still lingers, the perceptions that we have, the racialist perceptions we have about certain people, is something that still lingers even in 2020, and so forth. Okay, so when you guys answer these questions, what I want you to think about is how are aspects of distribution, recognition, participation, and capability necessary for environmental justice? And again, environmental justice being justice for people regarding environmental resources. All right? So that takes up the middle part of the book, part 2, from pages 45 to 103. And I would say you don't have to necessarily read everything. I just want you to get the big picture. When he's getting in the weeds with other philosophers about why their theory is wrong, you can skip over that. Just make sure you get the big picture. The big picture is typically laid out at the beginning and the end of each section. So he says in the beginning, this is what I'm going to do, then he does it, and then he wraps it up nice and neatly at the end. Okay, so let's now turn to the other issue, the question of ecological justice. This comes in part 3, doing justice to nature. So if environmental justice concerns justice for human beings regarding environmental resources, what it does not include is something like justice for animals, justice for not just individual animals, but species and groups of animals, justice for biotic areas as a whole, ecosystems, biotic communities, something like a lake, not just the animals that live within the lake, all right? So how do humans do justice to nature, or act justly toward nature, toward animals, toward species, and so on and so forth? Okay, I'll use this opportunity to explain something else that I left out early on. The opportunity being the difference between thinking about the good of individual animals and the good of species or groups of animals. So, one thing that the Rawlsian liberal distributive theory of justice leaves out, even for humans, I'm going to go back to talking merely about humans for a second, is the difference between talking about distributing goods and rights to individual citizens versus communities and groups of citizens. So one of the things that the more critical philosophers like Jung and Nussbaum talk about is how we need to have justice for communities and groups of people, not merely individuals. The example of racism draws this out. So when someone is the recipient of racist treatment, they are an individual because they're an individual person. But probably they are not getting that racist treatment merely for their individuality. If we're talking about a black man, for example, who experiences, let's say, racist treatment by, let's say, a police officer, then the police officer typically sees that person as really a member of a larger group of people, black men, and has all these presumptions about what black men and black people are like. And so, in a sense, the reason why that person receives this racist treatment is not really because of anything particular or individual to them, but because they are one member of this larger group, and it is this large group, black people, that kind of as a community, as a whole, have been the recipients of racist treatment in America and other places, but we're talking about America. So, in the context of recognition, these critical philosophers talked about the necessity of including communities and groups, not just individuals. So that's another departure from the distributive theory of justice, which basically focuses merely on individuals. So, returning to the question of animals, animal rights is not something that's terribly new. It's been around since at least the 60s, but in proto-forms before that. Represented most well probably by someone like Peter Singer, who said that animals can feel pain, therefore they need to be in our moral community. When we make moral decisions that affect individual animals, because they can feel pain, we need to include and recognize them. We need to see their capability for feeling pain, recognize them as sentient beings, and therefore draw them into our moral community. But because a dog or a cat or a horse or a cow can't really vote, they're not going to be full participants. But other philosophers like, I forget his name. Christopher Stone, I believe, said that, well, maybe a dog or a cat or a cow can't vote, but you, as a steward, as a representative of those animals, you can vote. So, just as you have a guardian or representative for a child who might represent the child's interest, let's say if their parents die and they need to go to court and make arrangements about money and the estate and so forth, you would have someone who is a representative of that child. Well, you can take that theory of representation and apply it to animals. So maybe you could have participation. Kind of beside the point for right now. But the point is that Peter Singer's approach really only covers individual animals. And so other environmental ethicists come along and say, well, we need to be sensitive to groups and species. So we have that already in our country with, for example, the Endangered Species Act. It's about, we see a good not merely in the individuality of particular animals, but in their species as well, in their community or in their group. So that's an example of how we can expand political environmental justice to non-human entities like individual animals and groups of animals. But other philosophers go further than that. So someone who actually came before Peter Singer, who was really one of the first ecologists in America in the 20th century, named Aldo Leopold, who wrote a famous essay called The Land Ethic. He was talking about not just the whole, like the group of species or the community of animals, but rather the entire biotic community I don't mean entire as in nature. I mean like this particular ecosystem, this particular area over here, this lake and all its surrounding animals and everything that depends on it. And so he said that we need to see the value of the ecosystem, of the biotic community. And the basic idea in his land ethic was that actions are right to the extent that they preserve and protect the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community, and wrong to the extent that they harm those prospects. So he's saying that we need to recognize the land as some kind of entity that can receive and deserves our moral treatment. So I think I mentioned this in one of the last videos, but what we're talking about here is something called intrinsic value. Intrinsic value, or inherent worth, is contrasted with instrumental value. So money only has instrumental value because it's a means to an end. Otherwise, it's just green paper that means nothing, right? It's only worth something to the extent that it can get you something else. But something like happiness is an intrinsic value. When I ask, why do you want to be happy? That kind of sounds like a stupid question because it's sort of self-evident that happiness is a good that is self-justifying. You don't want to be happy to get somewhere else. Happiness is the end. But then some things like health are both intrinsically good and instrumentally good. So it's just intrinsically good to be healthy because that is part of what it means to flourish as a physical human being. But when you are healthy, you can also do things like a healthy grandfather can take his granddaughter and fish in the sea or in the lake or wherever, and can do those things because he's got a healthy body that's maintaining him. Okay, so what we're talking about for ecological justice is how we can use the ideas of participation, recognition, capabilities, and distribution to think about the good of individual animals, groups of animals, the good of biotic communities, and all of their complex interrelated parts. So that's basically what I want you to know from this book. So as you're answering the questions in the discussion, again, I'm just looking for broad strokes from y'all. What is environmental justice, ecological justice? How can the aspects of those four categories be incorporated, and what do they each have to offer? So as you read this, read it economically. I mean, I myself was skipping through parts that I didn't think it was very germane for us. So look at the questions and then read according to the questions that I want you to answer. Also look at the table of contents because it neatly organizes everything, and then the sections within each of the first three sections, each of the three sections of the book, excuse me. Alright, so that about wraps it up for this video, which was shorter. And by the way, this guy Schlosberg is, he's a political scientist, not a philosopher, so you probably noticed that this book was a little bit easier to read than other books, because philosophers sometimes like to sound very abstruse. But I thought this was pretty clear, so I thought that you guys would be able to read it and understand it with a shorter video. Hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. We will see each other next week for the lecture on De Boer's environmental sovereignty. It'll be similar with that, where you won't have to read the whole book, and I'll highlight which sections you will need to read. Alright, catch you on the flip side.